This is Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lafrac. If you're a regular listener of Vermont Public or a viewer of Vermont PBS, you're likely aware of a recent executive order made by President Trump that directs the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's Board of Directors to cease federal funding for NPR and PBS. Now, for some context, this is not the first time CBB funding has been under threat. Reaching back to the Nixon administration and through the efforts in the ensuing years, mostly by congressional Republicans like former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, there have been calls to defund public media. We'll dig into what's driving these efforts as we welcome Vermont Public's CEO Vijay Singh, who's with you now in our Colchester studios. Vijay, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And this note before we get started, despite Vijay's role as head of this organization, we are interviewing him just as we would any other official that appears on this program. Vijay has not had any role in our preparation for this segment or any advance notice of our line of questioning. And listeners, if you have questions for Vijay Singh, please don't hesitate to call in. He's just on for the first segment of the program today, and the number to call is 800-639-2211. You can also send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. So, Vijay, let's start with the basics here. What is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? When was it created, and for what purpose?
So there was a piece of legislation in 1967 passed called the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Act. And it created this third-party entity that is funded by Congress and always 2 years in advance to avoid political meddling. And really the basic function is to take the money that is appropriated by Congress and disperse it to public media institutions across the country.
So the CPB was designed, as you say, to be a private nonprofit entity, free from government influence. Can the president then eliminate its funding just by issuing an executive order?
So the thinking from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, as well as NPR and PBS, is no. They don't see it as lawful, and they're going to take I forget exactly how they said it, but they're going to try everything to make it clear that this is not legal. That's my understanding too. Again, the president has the authority to appoint board members to CPB, and the authority stops there. Everything else lives with the organization itself or with Congress.
As I understand it, he's tried to fire at least 3 of the board members, right?
That's correct. So earlier in the week, before the executive order came out, an email was sent to 3 of the 5 board members to say that they're fired. And CPB's response was, there's no authority in the executive branch to fire our board members.
So even if the president cannot issue an order ending CPB funding all on his own, Congress could vote to do so. It's been tried before, as I said at the top, but those efforts have failed due to bipartisan support for public media. Is there something different about the effort, in your view, this time around that puts the funding more at risk?
I think the clear attempts, whether it's the CPB board members or the executive order we were just talking about, the threat will not go away under this administration. So I think the threat feels more aggressive than it ever has in the past. Like you mentioned earlier, this conversation has come up many times. What has always protected this funding and the role of public media is, like you said, bipartisan support. I think that's still there, but as we know, how Congress is working with the administration feels a little bit different than it has in the past as well. So I would say overall, this threat feels more aggressive than ever.
Vermont Public often mentions during membership drives, and it's true, that the lion's share of our funding comes from the local community. That's local underwriters, people who choose to contribute. How much is Vermont Public reliant then on CPB funding?
So direct value to us, direct amount of revenue from CPB funding is about $2 million, or 10% of our annual operational budget. But it goes deeper than that exact dollar amount. So what is at risk here is the health of the entire network. While it's 10% of our budget, and that is not insignificant for us and our ability to provide service to Vermont, there are many stations across the country where that percentage is much higher, something like 40%. And for those stations, I can't imagine they will find a way to stay operational. They may go out of business the next day. And when that happens, there's a ripple effect across the network. We rely on our connection to our national partners, as do these other small stations. And if those stations can't support our national partners, that has an effect on us. Everything, not just our programming, but there's a lot of technology behind the scenes that we rely on from NPR and PBS to, again, deliver this service across the state of Vermont.
I want to get to some of those other issues in just a moment, but first I want to take a call from Bob, who's on the line in Rutland. Hi, Bob. You're on the line with CEO Vijay Singh.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask your opinion as to, does this seem like a little more personal, coming from a government official, if we will, a public government official, than it has in the past? And this also being the same individual who currently they're working on in the budget to provide like $300 million so the person can go around the country or around the world to participate in golf tournaments.
Vijay?
I can't say how personal it might be. I mean, I understand what Bob is thinking and feeling here. What I can say is there is clearly a move to limit press freedom, and I think taking away funding from public media is really about press freedom. What we deliver on a local level is news and crucial information, especially in emergency situations, and really connection within a community and connection across the country, the local community to the national level. And so taking away our funding is limiting our ability to do that. And I think you see this approach from this administration. I don't know how personal that is. Again, I'm not going to comment on that aspect of it, but clearly there is an attempt to control how the press operates in the United States.
I appreciate the call from Bob there in Rutland. Again, we're speaking with Vermont Public CEO Vijay Singh. You can join this conversation if you have a question about Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the funding, and the efforts to cut that funding. You can call us at 800-639-2211 or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Vijay, getting back to this thing you were talking about, the ripple effect, if some of these smaller stations, which rely much more on CPB funding than, say, Vermont Public does, a lot of these are in smaller rural communities in America, and the public media stations don't have a large enough listener or viewer population in those areas to keep their stations going if that funding does go away. Besides the ripple effect you were talking about with the technology, et cetera, what would the people who rely on those particular public stations lose if their stations went dark?
In many cases, this is the only local media organization and the only local news organization in these areas. So they lose everything. One of the things that we talk a lot about our news service, which is very important. But again, underneath what we deliver as a organization, as a network, is connection. And so I think loneliness is an epidemic in this country. And so what I worry about, besides the creation of all these news deserts and the lack of media, locally controlled media and local news, is really connection to each other. And we will leave behind a lot of folks who will only feel more alone.
I have heard the argument, though, and I think the administration is making this argument, that there are enough diverse news sources these days that people don't need to rely on public media, that they can use the internet, they can find out their information that way. Is there a hole in that argument, in your view?
100%. I think that's a misunderstanding of media, a misrepresentation of how media works today. The key element of this being our public funding and the fact that we are not driven by commercial interests. In the Corporation for Public Broadcasting Act that we were talking about earlier, it specifically calls out public media for being an alternative to commercial media. And that makes us so different than anything that's available today. You can compare us to other for-profit news organizations or media companies, but a lot of people say, well, what about social media? This is empowering independent creators and so on. And I am not disparaging any independent creator who decides to meet an audience need on social media, but social media platforms themselves are commercial media. They are driven by clicks and ad revenue and so on. We are not. We are driven by delivering service to our community and especially folks who can't afford media otherwise. And we don't make our audience the product like social media does. So we are still different even in 2025.
I think the other point that is important, and maybe you can speak to this, is that for a lot of these folks in these areas that rely on public media, there's no paywall here. There's nothing for them to pay to. It's a free service for everyone. So If, for example, there were flash flood warnings that needed to go out, if there was an emergency broadcast that was super important about a major health risk to the community, would public media be the chief way that folks in certain areas would get that information?
100%. And you've seen this here in Vermont in the flooding that's happened in recent years, more recently in North Carolina and other natural disasters across the country, the wildfires in California. We don't make choices based on the market size. If something happens in the Northeast Kingdom and we need to report on it, we need to give people crucial information, we're going to do that because of our responsibility to serving everyone in Vermont. Commercial media will not necessarily make that choice because they are driven by market size and how much revenue they can create and so on. So that is absolutely unique. Another part of what we do that's unique is our educational mission. So on the PBS side of things, about 50% of children who do not attend preschool rely on PBS educational services. And that is essential when you think about investing in the future of the United States and investing in marginalized communities and folks who can't afford other types of services to raise a good human being.
The most common complaint, though, made by those who want CPB funding to go away is that public media, whether it's NPR or PBS, is prone to a left-wing bias. And so a taxpayer who leans the other way shouldn't have to support what they see as liberal media. How would you respond to that argument?
I understand the idea, and I think it is true that all humans are biased in some way. And journalists are not immune to that concept. But I trust in the process of journalism. We have a very rigorous process and actually a very expensive process. That's why it's expensive to do what we do, because it is so rigorous. And it is built to manage all of the inherent bias that someone may have. We are beholden to the truth, and we do the best job we can to make sure that various voices are represented. We always ask the question, what voice is not here, and how can we do a better job of including them? We will not always get it right, but the process that we trust in, that I have trust in, that we've built trust in as a society over time, that's what we hold true to, and I think that's what helps us navigate these types of criticisms.
You said something very interesting there, and it's a difficult topic to bring up, but I want to bring it up anyway. You mentioned that we often seek out voices that you don't normally hear, and this can be from groups that have been traditionally marginalized. When those groups are given a platform on public media, do you think that is then considered a liberal bias by those who are wondering, why are you having someone on from the LGBTQ community or someone, again, from a marginalized group?
It may well be. I wouldn't dismiss that is a factor. But on the other side, I would say we do need to make sure that all perspectives are represented. All ideologies are represented. So marginalized communities, certainly, again, that is specifically called out in the CPB Act. But we also need to make sure that folks who, maybe if they have that perspective, have a chance to weigh in on why they see it that way.
Right.
And that, I think, is a crucial part of navigating this perceived bias issue.
Yeah, I don't think we should be afraid to have those discussions. I mean, I really think we talk about stories from every corner, and we understand that not everyone in Vermont, voted for, Joe Biden, for example, or Hillary Clinton. We understand that there are different viewpoints here, but there's nothing wrong with having that discussion. That's what I'm looking to get that message out. That if you want to, call in or say something that you think we are doing something in a way that's biased, let us know that view. If you're respectful about it, we can have a conversation. I've heard Newt Gingrich speaking with Steve Inskeep on Morning Edition, and they had really thoughtful and respectful conversations. Then I would see Newt Gingrich, a week later going on a cable news show saying that, it's just a liberal news media, that we've got to defund them. And I don't understand. I have a really hard time with that connection there.
Yeah, I think the adherence to facts, our ability to and our desire to invite in as many different voices and these difficult conversations is, again, what makes us different.
I want to ask another question about a complaint that we do hear about, and I think this was something, again, that's leading this latest effort to defund the CPB or to have them stop giving the funding. And that's that public media underwriting crosses the line of commercial advertising, that it's misleading to say that we are not running commercials or beholden to corporate advertising interests. What is the distinction between underwriting, let's say, and traditional commercials?
So it comes down to some very specific phrasing in terms of the regulation, what the FCC guidelines are that we follow. But philosophically, there is a difference between folks who support us with underwriting, our business sponsors, and a traditional advertiser. And that is, there is no control of where the money comes from and how that influences our programming. Our business supporters, local businesses who support what we do, are behind the idea that we are completely independent and we deliver on these services that are not driven by market economics and so on. And that's really the philosophical difference between underwriting and advertising.
Where do things stand right now? What should we expect to see? Should we expect to see if there's a vote in Congress to defund the CPB?
Difficult to say. I think everything is up in the air right now. What we know is that the continuing resolution that was recently passed is effective until September. Typically, CPB funding is dispersed from the Treasury in October. So these are the dates that we're looking at when we may have a clearer picture of what's going to actually happen. But there's so much uncertainty now, and that makes this moment really difficult to navigate.
Vijay, finally, if you were speaking to somebody who's very skeptical about the mission of public media, and you just had like an elevator pitch to give them, what would you say to change their mind, or at least make them more open to the possibility that it's okay to have this, again, it's a very small amount of funding that taxpayers, send to the CPB each year to fund us. What would you say?
There's a clear connection between the health of democracies around the world and how much we spend on public media. And aside from those numbers and all the stats you can look at, just listen, just watch. Tune in for an hour, a PBS News Hour. Tune in for Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and make your mind up yourself.
Vijay Singh, the CEO of Vermont Public, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to explain these issues to us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have to take a quick break, and when we come back, the Eastern Townships of Quebec get the spotlight in a new book arguing that the region has far-reaching influence that goes well beyond the borders of the province. We'll speak with the authors of Quebec's Eastern Townships and the World, a Region and its Global Connections. You're listening to Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lefrak. Montreal is a world-class city known for its award-winning cuisine, old port cobblestone streets, and a chic urbanism people often describe as having a European flair. But while Montreal may be the first place people think of when the province of Quebec comes up in conversation, longtime residents of Vermont, and Montrealers as well, know there's a bounty of culture, history, natural beauty, and mouthwatering food to be found in the area known as the Eastern Townships. It's certainly not news to Christopher Kirky and Andy Holman, who want to get the word out about all the region has to offer. And it's what led them to edit a book called Quebec's Eastern Townships and the World, a Region and its Global Connections. Christopher Kirky is the director of the Center for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh. He joins us now in our Colchester studios. Chris, thanks for being here.
I'm pleased to be with you, Mitch.
And joining us remotely today is Andy Holman, professor of history and director at the Canadian Studies program at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. Andy, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Great to be with you, Mitch.
And listeners, you can join this conversation. How often do you visit the townships? Or if you're a resident there, what do you appreciate most about the region and want others to know? Are there some places in the townships that define the region for you or fall under the must-visit category? You can give us a call at 1-800-639-2211. That number is 800-639-2211. Or send an email to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Now, before we get into all the townships have to offer, let's define the boundaries here. Chris, let me start with you. Where are the Eastern Townships located in Quebec?
It's a wonderful question because it's, I guess you might say, been evolving almost since Indigenous times. The first sort of administrative boundaries that were drawn of the townships, that was first enabled in 1792. Less than a decade after the Treaty of Paris. And if you look at, from that point forward, if you look at how various government entities have tried to define precisely topographically, geographically, what the townships is, it shifts and has shifted over time. And so, at some points in time, it's smaller, it's more to the east, it's more to the west, and so on. If you take a look, for example, I guess most recently, in 1981, when the government of Quebec came up with a label, a title called S3, that region, which some people think is synonymous with Eastern Townships, isn't, because it's a region that only covers about half of the township's traditional territory. But for us, when we think about it, here in Vermont, if we're going up, crossing the border, when you cross the border, are you in the townships? And most people would say yes. And it goes as far east as Lac-Mégantic, and in some cases a little beyond, and as far north as the lower shore of the St. Lawrence in some cases. So it's expansive.
Population-wise, about how many people live there?
I can't say for certain. The core population center, of course, is the city of Sherbrooke, Montreal, Quebec City, and then Sherbrooke. So the third largest city in the area, but it's populated in a wonderful range of villages and towns that. If you look at where Sherbrooke is on the map and it's spread out, it's a fabulous part of the world. Yeah.
Andy Holman, how did the idea for this book get started? What prompted all this?
Well, I have to point back to my colleague Chris Kirky, who came up with the great idea that there hadn't been something talking about a book anyway, talking about the Eastern Townships and its connections with the world. And so this was, several years ago, I want to say 2019, when he first pitched the idea to Cheryl and to me that we should do some kind of a project, one that would draw on the expertise of scholars, not just from the townships themselves, but people who have an interest in other places. And that's a pretty expansive list, because I'm not sure that I've met anybody who doesn't have an Eastern Township story or a relative or having been there once and enjoyed something lovely about it. So it started back in 2019, and then we developed it as a book project in which we would have a number of different contributors who would chime in from different scholarly disciplines in some respect about the Eastern Townships.
And you mentioned Cheryl, that's Cheryl Gosselin, who's also an editor of this book, not joining us today, but luckily we have you two both to tell us about this wonderful region. I'm curious about who kind of founded this region, Chris. I mean, how did this all get started? Is there a particular point in history where people decided, okay, this is something we want to, create and found here?
Well, it's a mixture, quite frankly, of folks who were there. I mean, initially, the Abenaki populated the region, if you will, and then through a variety of forces, emigration to what would ultimately become Canada, American immigrants in the post-Revolutionary War period, or during the Revolutionary War and post-Revolutionary War, who sought, to create a farm stand in the region. And in fact, the Lieutenant Governor of Lower Canada, Mr. Clark, had in fact incentivized folks to move up here, providing them with plots of land, a lot of 200 acres in size, for example. And, slowly but surely, the region, became known officially in 1806 as the Eastern Townships. And the Francophones who lived in the region, within about less than 30 years, were calling it Canton de l'Est. That became, I think, fairly regular by about 1850. So a mixture of folks.
You mentioned that the Abenaki, of course, were here first. Was there some tension between the Abenaki and those more European settlers who came in?
Andrew, do you want to tackle that one?
Not in the sense that you would find in terms of Indigenous and white settler contact and conflict in other places, such as, southern New England, for example, or in the West. The there were agreements on the East Coast between Abenaki peoples and settlers there, but English colonists. But in the region that we're talking about now, the trace was lighter. And so it becomes a kind of an interesting process of the layering of peoples. First the Wabanaki, then the French settlers, then the English colonists, then the American loyalists, late loyalists. And so it's kind of, to use a literary term, it's kind of like a palimpsest where you've
Hmm.
got these kind of different sort of rich layers that are laying over one another. And I think that's part of the characteristics of the townships.
Oh, that's so interesting. Andy, let me stick with you for a moment. When I drive up through this area, it strikes me as being very rural, agricultural. It looks a lot like parts of Vermont, actually. What are the townships
Yeah.
known for as far as industry, produce, things like that?
Yeah. Well, it's more complex perhaps than most people who do a kind of a quick drive or a pleasure trip for a weekend would find out. So it's got obviously a base of agriculture, which has been right from settlement times, from the 1830s and 40s in particular. But then overlaying on top of that is a place that has lots of fast-moving rivers. It's got an industrial basis to it. So textile production, for example, mining in the late 19th century, including asbestos extraction. These are things that gave its kind of complex character. Hydroelectric generation is another one. And then if you add on top of that, if you want to call it an industry, the tourism industry, which has been in place since the 1890s at least, you've got, quite a complex economic basis.
So, the subtitle for this book is A Region and Its Global Connections. Chris, let's dive into that a little bit. How have the Eastern Townships been linked over time to global trends, and what global trends are we talking about here?
Sure. We wanted to make certain with this book volume to make sure that there was thematic consistency across each chapter. It wasn't an effort per se just to say, would you please profile agricultural practices in the townships? That in of itself is important. But we felt to provide, as I suggest, this thematic unity, we asked each contributor to essentially tackle two common questions, one of which was how have the Eastern Townships been influenced by or linked to significant global trends, developments, and identities? And the second was to ask how have the people in the Eastern Townships, conversely, in the events and practices that mark their lives there, how have those influenced or contributed to global trends, developments, and identities? So, and we think across all the chapters, our contributors successfully address those two questions. And it's fascinating because in some cases, I think it's fair to say that external developments had a very marked impact, whereas in other cases, it's surprising perhaps to see that developments, we talked about agriculture a moment ago, and you look at sustainable agricultural practices that were developed in the townships and how some of those have been exported worldwide and have been adopted worldwide. So
Things like
it's
farm to table, stuff like that?
very much so.
Yeah.
What we think about in Vermont or perhaps upstate New York is really pioneered first and foremost in the eastern townships of Quebec. Yeah.
Andy, I know that you folks didn't set out to necessarily write a history book here. You want to make it relevant to today's times, and it's more about the township's relevance to the wider world. But there are some historical markers here that point to the region's influence that I find really interesting. What can you tell us about, for example, Canadian soldiers from the townships and their participation in the Civil War?
Right. This is a wonderful chapter written by Jane Jensen, who wanted to study this really interesting phenomenon that when the United States goes to war against itself in the early 1860s, what do borderlanders do and why? And it's the why part, I think, that's the most captivating part of the question. And it builds upon a strong literature that's out there about Canadians who volunteered to serve in the Union Army, and talks a little bit about the kind of connections that existed across the border prior to the Civil War itself, religious connections, familial connections, other kinds of regional connections that would have drawn young men from the Eastern Townships southwards to take part in this, what would have been considered at the time great adventure. I'm sure it didn't seem like much of an adventure once they were into the thick of things, but it's a fascinating chapter.
I mean, there's a whole chapter in the book on Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Chris, what's the link there?
Well, the link is as the president of the American Confederacy. Once he was out on awaiting trial, out on bond, and from Fort Monroe, he came north to Montreal in the summer of 1867, specifically late May of 1867. His wife, Verena, was here. Children were here already, sister-in-law, or mother-in-law, rather. And assorted Confederate sympathizers and Confederate officers who had relocated to what we'll call Quebec and Ontario at the time. You know, he knew when he arrived in Montreal, and he spent a brief period in Montreal from May till September of 1867, but Montreal didn't agree with him for a whole host of reasons. And one of his children, rather, were in school in Lennoxville, Quebec, what we now know as an arrondissement of Sherbrooke, or a suburb of Sherbrooke. They were there. He had gone out in early July of 1867 to visit them, and he really liked the little community of Lennoxville, which was under 1,000 people at the time. So he convinced his wife, and they moved to Clark's, or the British American Hotel, as it was called. And he was there through July of 1868. He did go back to the U.S. and actually traveled to Cuba and visited family between November and March of 1868 before coming back. And then ultimately he would leave to go to take a steamer from Quebec City, him and his wife, and moved to the UK. And while he was here, and this is, I think, of fundamental importance and why we wrote this chapter, because there hasn't been a lot of scholarship on this issue. It's very clear that Jefferson Davis was driven by two overriding issues. In the background, always there, and we can see that through his correspondence, was his upcoming trial. And he was supposed to go to trial in November. It was postponed. And then throughout 1868, it continued to be postponed. And that always weighed very heavily in his mind. But at the same time, here is a Southern gentleman, if you will, from a well-to-do background. He had done well, but he is now sort of on the ropes, if you will. And his honor, his Southern patriarchal background is being fundamentally challenged. He has no money of any consideration. He's looking for support. People are providing some support to him, but he's looking to essentially find not just a job, but to generate wealth to provide security for his family. And he's obsessed by this, and he tries a variety of things. When he's in the townships, he specifically looks to potential of copper mining, and which was huge in the eastern townships of Quebec. In fact, the largest copper mining deposits globally in 1850s were in the townships of Quebec. And so he looks and he works with this guy, and it doesn't come to fruition. And he's trying to sell, people on investing in this as well. And ultimately, he arrives as he departed, which is sort of a dispirited, dejected man who's still awaiting trial and still hasn't found his fortune. But it's really a very, very, very low point. And he's arguably, one might say, the most famous American to have come to Quebec and Montreal, and then specifically Lennoxville and the townships.
It's just fascinating that there's even that connection there. I think a lot of people will be surprised to find that out. We're going to take one more quick break, and when we come back, we're going to hear a lot more about the far-reaching influence of Quebec's eastern townships, speaking with Andy Holman and Chris Kirky. You're listening to Vermont Edition. Welcome back to Vermont Edition. I'm Mitch Wertlieb in for Michaela Lefrak. We're talking about not just the regional, but the global influence of the Eastern Townships of Quebec. And we're joined by Christopher Kirky, Director of the Centre for the Study of Canada and Institute on Quebec Studies at the State University of New York College at Plattsburgh, and Andy Holman, Professor of History and Director at the Canadian Studies Program at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. They are authors and editors of the new book, Quebec's Eastern Townships and the World, a Region and Its Global Connections. And listeners, if you want to get in on this conversation, give us a call at 1-800-639-2211. That's 800-639-2211. If you've never been there, are you curious about the Eastern Townships? What would you like to know about its global influence over the years? And if you're a resident or a frequent visitor, what are some hidden gems people should know about? You can send us an email as well to vermontedition@vermontpublic.org. Andy, I want to ask about how folks in the townships feel about Montrealers. I mentioned at the top that, you mentioned Quebec and people think, oh, Montreal, what an amazing city. I wonder if there's that classic big city versus rural resident sort of tension there, or is that kind of overblown?
I have to preface my remarks by saying that I don't live in the township, so it's not a sort of a daily cultural touchstone that would be relevant for me. But my impression is that there are a couple of different perspectives. One of them is the one that you suggest, that there's this kind of I'm not sure, antipathy perhaps from the region towards the big metropolis, which in so many ways has its effect economically, politically, culturally over its regions, not just the Eastern Townships, but the other ones that surround it too. But I think we have to remember that a good many Eastern Townshippers are Montrealers, right? Or they have been in the past. And so, on the other hand, that kind of antipathy that wouldn't make sense if you see yourself as being of the city or metropolitan in some regard. So that's how I would answer that question.
And Chris, how would you answer that question? What is the relationship, let's say, between Montreal and the Eastern Townships?
I'm fortunate in the sense that I get to go to the townships every 3 or 4 weeks. And while, like Andy, I don't claim to have, foot on the ground daily understanding of the relationship, I can honestly say in 25 years I've been involved in the townships that I don't think per se, I don't ever recall anybody from the townships, be it in Sherbrooke or anywhere else, sort of, I think they do look at, much like, I think this is perhaps a good way to think about it, much like New Yorkers think of New York City as its own world, as Manhattanites think of Manhattan as the world, right? And
Sure.
What do you mean by upstate New York? That's when you leave Manhattan. To some degree, I think there's that sense of, because of the size and scale of Montreal, that it's its own world. But I've never heard anyone sort of say, "Oh gosh, I wouldn't go to, it's so big," or it's I wouldn't feel welcome there. That's clearly not the case. And Montrealers, I think, very candidly, the parts of Quebec that they go to for restorative pleasure and tourism, if you will, and go to their cottage. That's one of the key areas that Montrealers look at and go to, along with the Laurentians and others. So it's important.
Andy, what about things like food or drink, or is there anything particular to the Eastern Townships that they are sort of known for?
Well, most recently, I suppose you could put ice cider in that category as a place that's developed this kind of sub-industry in the alcoholic beverage front. But beyond that, I think they're known for things that other regions of Quebec are known for too, just in terms of maple syrup and maple-related industry, for sure.
Well, if you're
Um,
listening in the Eastern Townships or Montreal, by the way, you certainly feel free to weigh in on this conversation and let us know about some things about the relationship or, the food, the drink, or places you really want to visit. Give us a call at 800-639-2211. Chris, you have some thoughts on this, too.
I do, Mitch. Some years ago, I undertook a long study, which I need to go back and revisit on sort of the birth and of ice cider in Quebec, because it was created by a man named Christian Barthemuth. He was in the Dunham region at the time. He currently, this is 1989, 1990, he currently lives near Fredericksburg. And he thought, ice wine, that's great, made with grapes. What about these really peculiar apples that if we left them on the tree and a good cold weather comes for -10 for consecutive days, and then we pick it and we extract the juice from it, and he created what we know today, and he's still at it. His ice cider shop, Clos Serignan, creates his ice ciders, and they're just, his are particularly fabulous. I mean, his original is just crazy. But you now have, at one point, I think there were 55 or 60 ice cider producers as far north as Île-aux-Cordes, past Quebec City, and north of Montreal. The bulk of them, though, tend to be in the townships. And it's a product. In fact, it's here in Vermont for some time. Eden, the premier ice cider producer in the state, makes a very nice series of ice ciders, and it's a phenomenal product. So yes,
Sounds delicious. What would you eat with that, for example? Is there something people like to eat with ice cider?
yeah. Some people choose to have various cheeses. Some like foie gras. Some just like plain angel food cake. Some like it with chocolate. But I want to encourage anybody who tries it to try it straight up first, nice and cold. You know, not like a bottle of wine at 55 degrees, but cold out of your fridge at like 38 degrees. And just try it. It's so, and you're like, wow, if you like apple juice and you've tried perhaps ice wine, you'll love this.
With just the few minutes we have left here, I want to get to something I think that feels really important right now. Fans of the mystery writer Louise Penny know that Knowlton, Quebec is reimagined as Three Pines in many of her novels, and there are popular tours of the region based on her books. It brings up this delicate subject, though, as, you know, Louise Penny made news recently saying she would forego her American tour promoting her new book because of President Trump's hostile tariffs on Canadian goods and his remarks about making Canada America's 51st state. Now, you write that there isn't a huge Anglophone presence necessarily in the Eastern Townships, but there's generally been a warm Anglophone-Francophone relationship over the years. Andy, is that relationship now at risk of dissolving beyond repair because of what's going on right now?
Do you mean the relationship between townshippers and folks on
Let's say
south of the border?
Yeah, in Vermont or
Yeah.
anywhere else.
Well, I think it is, and this is unfortunate. Although I'd have to say that the meeting that took place yesterday between the Prime Minister and the President seems to, for a time anyway, point to a path forward. But for the past 12 weeks, it's been maybe more, maybe 14 weeks. It's been undeniable that there's a kind of anger that's emerged amongst Canadians. My family, in particular, in Southern Ontario, I see this through them, but also having visited them through neighbors and others, and a kind of surprise that that Canada would be targeted in the way it was, and that's turned to a kind of resilience, a sort of low-grade boil, if you will, that Canadians are now engaging in a kind of not buy Canadian, but buy Canadian and buy other stuff that's not American campaign.
Yeah. Well, there was even a
And
Vermonter who went on a Canada apology tour because, people are aware of this on both sides of the border. That is
Sure.
definitely for sure. We have Jennifer on the line from Thetford. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to make the comment. I hadn't heard anyone mention anything about the sugar shacks that are part of their tradition of the Eastern Townships that we have enjoyed over the years.
Oh, how about that, Chris? What about sugar shacks?
Sure. Sugar shacks, and you're correct to point out that the Eastern Townships has a good maple sugaring industry and presence. I'd also say that this is obviously Quebec-wide. It's not specific to the townships per se, but you're right. In one of our chapters by Darren Bardotti, who's a professor at Bishop's University in Lennoxville. He talks about how agriculture in the Eastern Townships has transitioned over the years, and he talks a little bit about the maple sugaring industry. It's it's there, and it's clearly part of what identifies, if you will, the Eastern Townships agricultural industry.
Jennifer, I don't know if you're still on the line with us or not, but if you are, I wonder if you would get up to the townships very much.
Oh yeah. We have been going up for years, and I'd say we're there every maybe 2 weeks, at least once every 2 weeks. There's
Wow.
just a lot of there's a lot of little. I'm actually not in Thetford. I'm in Fletcher, so I'm even closer. And my husband and I, we've been going up for years, and we have lots of friends that enjoy the restaurants, the hiking, the gravel biking, the skiing, the spas. A lot of people down here go up to the spas, but we try to get up there as often as possible and participate in as many things that are going on in all of the different communities. And I've always felt like very welcome, and everyone's very warm. And as of recently, with this talk that has been going on, I think the feeling that I get from people is more like they just can't believe that we're down here enduring this
So they feel sorry for us.
administration.
You're saying they feel sorry for
Yeah,
us.
I haven't. Yeah, and I haven't felt, anything other than that. Honest, I really have to be honest. And but as far as the sugar shacks, I just wanted to say we've enjoyed over the years going when the dinners are offered, and the multi-course meals, and some restaurants participate in them with farms, and some it's just family-run sugar shacks, but those are pretty spectacular. And we've been to a couple even north of Montreal, and they've just been mind-blowing. Some of them are really, really incredible. So if there's any foodies out there, I would suggest kind of looking into that and getting into a sugar shack during the seasons.
We definitely have some foodies listening, I'm sure. Jennifer, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Chris, in the minute or so we have left here, Jennifer mentioned the spas, and this is something, I don't know if this is relatively new, but I have been hearing that there are some spectacular spas up in the townships. Is that right?
That's correct. Particularly in a couple of communities, one of which is Magog itself, in the general Magog area. And because and it fits, because there's several downhill ski opportunities at Orford, at Vermont, and the like. The fact is, a lot of these spas have recently developed. A spectacular one is in North Hatley at Hovey Manor. It was rated last year the very top place to go on vacation in Canada. This Hovey Manor, it's spectacular. It's part of the Relais and Chateau property groups. It's not inexpensive, to be honest with you, but they've really started to push that envelope in the townships.
For a special occasion, perhaps it's just the right thing. Andy, last word to you, just a few seconds left here. What do you want people to take away from this book?
Well, I think whether they're scholars or not scholars, I think this is it's a compendium that should be measured on its ability to tell meaningful stories, and we've tried to do that with stories about people like Jefferson Davis or Harry K. Thaw, who makes an appearance in our introduction, or Sugar Ray Robinson, who makes an appearance in a chapter on boxing in Sherbrooke in the 1950s and 60s. And so I think people who pick up this book, they can open it wherever they wish. It's not like you have to read it in order, and you'll find, you're more than likely to find some kind of story about the people, which, after all, are the most important thing.
No question.
That make this region distinctive.
Andy Holman, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Chris Kirky as well. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure as well.
And the book is Quebec's Eastern Townships in the World, a Region and its Global Connections. That's it for today. You can weigh in on our show, pitch us ideas at Vermont edition of VermontPublic.org. Find us on Instagram as well. Today's show was directed by Aaliyah Papes. Our managing producer is John Ahrens, and our producers are Andrea Lorian and Daniela Fierro. Our call screener today was Rick Barrett. Theme music composed by Myra Flynn. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. Thanks so much for listening. We'll catch up again soon.